and that's how fierce the competition is. Rowan tells Simon that there is Sir Nindark, the official successor of Ivory Tower, and shows a huge guy, Shadalmare, who would probably major in magical combat. Rowan shows Simon the girl who is at the top of the class this year, Lorraine Arkbold, and says everyone thought she was admitted under special admissions because she is Nephthys' only daughter. But Rowan heard she took the admission exam and passed with a decent grade. Rowan says she didn't top the class, but everyone knows she is the best student in the class. Meanwhile, the matriculation ceremony begins, and after congratulating the students, the speaker tells the students to take extra care not to enter the forest and introduces the professors in charge of the first grade. Rowan gets emotional that they are all top-notch necromancers, and he has only seen them in magazines. Professor Bahil waves at students, and they start clapping. But when Simon says Nephthys is not there, Rowan tells him that the chancellor of such great prominence wouldn't come to a matriculation ceremony for mere first graders. Rowan says it would be an honor to meet Nephthys in third grade. But Simon thinks it's awkward because the Nephthys he knows is like a child. The students are told to get up from their seats because the student representatives will take an oath, and Simon wonders who those students could be. The speaker says the students with their names called should step up to the podium, and she calls special admission number 2, Sir Nindark. When the speaker calls special admission number 1, Simon Follentia, the whole hall becomes silent, but Simon and Rowan are shocked. Simon gets up, and students start whispering because they don't know who he is. Simon nervously steps up to the podium, and the speaker tells them not to be nervous and to read what's written on the paper. After taking the oath, Simon, sitting in the class, thinks Kiezen is an intense school as it holds classes on the day of the matriculation ceremony, and he feels awkward as everyone is talking about him. Simon feels he is starting the first day of class on pins and needles and wonders how many classes he has. Simon sees there is a course on summonology in the class schedule, and he gets excited because it's the magic his father uses. Suddenly, Professor Bahil Amager, a stylish and trendy necromancer, enters the class and is the professor of first-year catarology. Bahil is a young necromancer rising to stardom who became a member of the Crows Kiezen's core battling group in his late 20s. Bahil welcomes the students, says he'll teach them catarology, and tells them to introduce themselves as their name is called during attendance. After the attendance, Bahil says they are all full of charms, and he begins the class with the fundamental question of why they have to study catarology and asks if anyone knows what a curse is. Jame Victoria raises her hand and says that a curse is a type of dark magic that maintains one's power while weakening the opponent's. Bahil praises her, but some students might not understand what she says, so he gives an example. Bahil demonstrates that two knights with the same skill level start fighting vigorously and wait for the opponent to make a mistake. But the opponent doesn't surrender. At that moment, one of the knights screams out loud, staring the other knight down with a murderous look. The opposing knight flinches, turning pale, and finally, the sword slices through the opponent's shoulder, making him spill blood, and his movements start to shake. The knight begins to seize the chance to victory, and he corners the opponent, attaching the leg to impede his movements, throwing sand in his eyes, and beating his helmet with the sheath to distract him. Bahil explains that at the end, the knight cuts off the opponent's head, letting it fall to the ground, and tells the students that even the most primitive and barbarous battle of clashing weapons is simply a series of actions that weakens the opponent to reach victory step by step. Bahil decides to demonstrate how modern necromancers fight and says they defeat the opponent with one move and win. Bahil says the curse has the lightest and simplest structure among various dark magics, and its quick activation is another characteristic. Bahil suddenly approaches a student, slams his head on the desk with magic, and points a sword at his head, saying this is how modern necromancers fight. The students are impressed, and Bahil says he doesn't know what they'll decide to major in, but he is sure more than 80% of them will also decide to take his class in the second semester. Bahil tells them that cartology is the core of modern necromancers, and the reason behind that is the price because cartology is the most effective way to stand against their main enemies. Bahil says while necromancers have cursing, priests have blessings, and the difference lies in them that one strengthens while the other weakens the target. When Bahil asks if anyone can tell why cursing is better than a blessing, Jame answers cursing is faster to cast than a blessing. Therefore, cursing can accumulate weakening effects more quickly on the target. Bahel says her opinion is interesting, but it's incorrect because, according to scholars, the curse that has to be cast through an opponent's resistance is slower by a narrow margin than a priest's blessings. When Bahel asks if anyone else wants to answer, Hector Moore answers that nearly no one trains their weakened self. Bahel says he will remember Hector's name because his answer is correct that weakening spells can't be warded off with training. Bahel explains they all train themselves under the assumption of being in regular condition, and the measure of their skill depends on how well they can perform, given all environmental factors are under their control. Bahel says humans are more sensitive creatures than they seem and can break down even with the slightest change. Bahel tells the students that, in other words, they don't need to cut off the entire arm of an archer aiming at them to win because they can obstruct his vision with conjunctivitis, make him nauseous, confuse his sense of distance, or distract his attention towards another object. Necromancers have a lot of ways to disrupt the enemy's situation, and Bale tells the students to think when they are tired or have a severe stomachache. Not many of them would train to prepare against curses but will take a day off. Bahel teaches them to remember that they should think about how to weaken others instead of how to strengthen themselves. Suddenly, he gives correction devices to the students to teach them how to cast a curse, and Simon gets excited he'll learn dark magic in first class. Bahel decides to teach them the exhaustion curse, so he tells them to hold the handles of the correction device and squeeze their darkness into the mold. Bahel says the key to a successful magic circle is how perfectly they can form the main rune word, which is a set of letters that have magical power. Bahel demonstrates that drawing out the rune words using the darkness will include magical effects and tells the students to lift the magic circle into the air if they have completed it. Simon is happy that he did it, but he sees others have done it too, and their circles are quite accurate while his own collapses. Bahel sees a few of the students' magic circles collapsing and says this happens when they don't refine their darkness properly, or the binding of their magic circle weakens. Bahel tells them to try again, and for those who maintain their magic circle, he tells them to get into actual practice. Bahel says each of them has a plant distributed with the correction device, so they have to aim at the plant and distribute the curse. Bahel says if there is a noticeable change to the plant, it means the magic circle worked properly. Hector and many students succeed, but Simon still tries to hold his magic circle in the air, and Bahel starts to see the difference in skill among students. Bale tells the students to repeat the practice to enhance the speed to complete the magic circle, and once they are satisfied with the speed, they should practice making the magic circle without using the correction device. Simon continues to fail to create a magic circle, and he wonders if he is doing something wrong. Simon remembers when he showed his flame of darkness to Lorraine and Nephthys. Lorraine said his darkness was swirling like a flame, which meant it was still in its vapor state. Simon thinks he is still unskilled at operating his mana, as Nephthys and Lorraine said, so he starts with the basics. Simon collects the mana as much as he can and decides to send it to the core all at once. Simon manages to create a magic circle, and when he succeeds in using the curse on the plant, he excitedly screams that he did it. Meanwhile, Bahel finishes the practice and tells the students to use the magic they learned. He says he sees special admission number 1 in the class, so he tells Simon to come forward. Bahel starts looking for an opponent for the excellent number 1 and chooses Hector Moore, who also has a good exam score. Bahel explains the rules that the only cure they are allowed to use is exhaust and cast it on the opponent. Bahel says the person whose knees or buttocks touch the ground first loses, and Hector says he'll compete without using the correction device. Bahir admires Hector's attitude, but he remembers after he mentioned how using the correction device was undesirable. Hector suggested a way to show off his skills and impress him. When Bahel asks if Simon will use the device, Simon replies he'll, so Bahel announces they can start on his mark. As they take positions, Bahel starts the match, and Simon immediately starts creating his magic circle. Simon claims not to be nervous, and while he is trying to complete his magic circle, Hector already creates his without the correction device and hits Simon. Simon feels tired with just one hit but also manages to complete his magic circle, and he just needs to float it, but it starts collapsing, so he decides to start over again. Meanwhile, Hector again uses exhaust on Simon, which makes him extremely tired, and Hector continues using exhaust. The class is shocked that the match seems over because Hector has already used 5 iterations, and they wonder if Simon is really number 1. Hector tells Simon to surrender himself because his situation is pitiful and again uses exhaust on him. Bahel thinks Hector is definitely a gem, and his talent is one thing, but he also has the mindset of Kizan students. Bahel thinks Hector will become an outstanding student who will survive until the 3rd grade, but he thinks Simon has no prior preparation or basic knowledge about dark magic. Bahel wonders why Neftis chose Simon as number 1 because the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 who are officially invited to Kizan without taking the admission exam of infamous difficulty are supposed to be the talents of the century. Bahel knows number 1 was always handpicked by Neftis and grew to be the most prominent figure in their fields.